Welcome to the second to last Common Agenda Rollout Education Campaign event. This is pollution prevention. And as a reminder, these events are meant to educate environmental advocates and network partners and volunteers on the common agenda and the chapters within the chapters and papers within the agenda. But without further ado, I'm going to pass along to Narissa, who's going to kick us off.
Thanks, Kyle, and good afternoon, everyone. For those of you who have been regularly attending these webinars, welcome back. And if this is your first one, welcome and thank you for tuning in. Today, we have a host of VCN partners and Common Agenda authors here to talk to us about pollution prevention. Today's authors are Connor Kish with the Sierra Club, Peter Anderson with Appalachian Voices, Jamie Brunkow with James River Association, Anna Killius, also with the James River Association, Stephanie Rinaldi with Friends of Buckingham, and Walton Shepard with the Natural Resources Defense Council. As you may know, usually we like to have a guest speaker at the top of these. Unfortunately, today we do not have one, but that is okay. That means there's a little bit extra time for our partners to talk about their chapters and also for the Q&A section. Just a reminder for the Q&A, we're going to allow each of the authors to present their paper first, and then at the end, we will take questions, but you do not have to wait till the end to submit your questions. You can submit them throughout the entirety of the program. So without further ado, I'll pass it to our first author, which is Connor Kish with the Sierra Club. Connor?
Thank you so much, Narissa, and good afternoon, everyone. And thank you all for taking some time to listen to all of us this afternoon to talk about our chapters that are, well, at least some of them, that are included in the VCN Common Agenda this year. I am first going to be talking about a paper that you can find on pages 109 and 110 of this year's Common Agenda, which is titled Ensuring Accountability in the Chemical Conversion Industry. I would like to thank Ellie Bamer with the Environment Virginia, Chris Land with the League of Conservation Voters, and Philip Segas with the Potomac Riverkeeper Network for co-authoring this paper with me and allowing me to be the presenter on it today. This issue is relatively new to the VCN briefing book process because it is relatively a new industry. And with that has brought relatively new legislation and state policy. Essentially, the chemical conversion industry deals with two separate issues. The first is that there are companies and industry across the country that are trying to take plastic waste and turn it into plastic again. And there are separate companies across the country that are trying to take plastics and that are waste plastics and turn them into other things. And those other things can include some seriously damaging stuff, including turning plastics into jet fuel, oil, waxes, and other pollutants. And the chemical conversion industry really doesn't do a great job of distinguishing itself between those two separate different processes. So earlier this year, the General Assembly faced a bill that would reclassify the chemical conversion industry. And instead of having it be a waste process, the General Assembly passed a bill at the behest of the industry to declare the chemical conversion industry a manufacturing process. These are innocuous definitions to the eye, however, they have really, really important consequences. Virginia's waste laws, which the chemical conversion industry previously fell under, are much stricter, involve much more community input, require much more data, and require higher level of sustained and consistent monitoring. Because the industry now is a manufacturing facility, those definitions that accompany it no longer fit in the solid waste laws. So I think the next question that comes up is, why is it important to care about this issue? And really the most important thing for everyone to know is that the entire industry itself, both the companies that try and turn plastic back into plastic and the companies that try and turn plastic into other things, have never, ever, ever across the entire country successfully operated at scale. What that means is there has never been a facility that has successfully done these things, and yet the laws are already changing for them. What that brings about is a complete list, as a complete laundry list of unknowns. We don't know what the emissions output of a successful facility would be. We don't know what the pollution and water or air pollution levels would be for a successful facility. We don't know what community impacts would be felt by a facility. We don't know whether taxpayer money will be used as incentives to build these facilities, which are essentially polluting facilities. And ultimately, we still don't know whether it can even happen. We don't know whether the science behind it is even proven. So there are a couple things that we can do, and the recommendations of the paper suggest that we do. Three main ones. The first is that the General Assembly absolutely must require a sophisticated regular reporting system for chemical conversion facilities of all kinds related to the intake, operational, and output aspects of the facility. And that encompasses all emissions monitoring and other pollutant tracking. Additionally, the General Assembly has to mandate a robust public outreach effort fully compliant with Virginia environmental justice policy. Like I mentioned earlier, because these facilities are now manufacturing facilities, there are many permitting requirements associated with solid waste that bring about more community input that have now been taken off the table. And we have to ensure that the regular reporting system includes making the permit accessible to community members and having opportunities for community members to ask questions about what's going on in the facility and have regular and easy access to the information that is tracking the emissions and other pollutant outputs. So our strategy is to ensure that if and when the industry can ever prove itself to be successful at scale and actually create something from plastic waste, that they have not completely rigged the system in their favor, so that when the facility is operating, it's operating in the dark and operating in the shadows without proper regulation. I think it's really important that the proper regulation, proper reporting, and proper systems be set up at first and on the onset of the facility before they actually begin constructing and actually begin operating these facilities. So just to wrap up, this is obviously a very new issue. You probably, if you're a longtime reader of the VCN Common Agenda, have not seen this before, and I expect it will continue to be an issue. So that begs the question, what can we do? Well, stay tuned. We are planning some efforts in the coming General Assembly session to elevate this issue and ensure that the chemical conversion industry, if they can ever prove themselves, are properly regulated under Virginia law. And so thank you. And I think I'm passing it back to Narissa.
Yep. Thanks, Connor. Next up, we have Peter Anderson with Appalachian Voices to talk to us about pipelines. Peter?
Great, thank you, Narissa. And since I was the person who didn't turn in my slides, I'm gonna have to try to share my screen and share my slides instead of having the VCN folks drive that ship. So if you'll bear with me 1 second. So the paper that I'm presenting is in the briefing book. It's called Stopping Unnecessary Pipelines and Phasing Out Fossil Fuel Buildout. So I got a couple of lovely pictures to show you all. And Narissa, do you see my pipeline slides coming up here?
Yes, but go ahead and click on present so it'll be bigger.
That's the idea here. Let's see. Somewhere there's a presentation button.
If you go to the far, well, it's right on my screen. It might be left on yours. There's like a little present button right next to share. You have like the highlighted yellow share.
Oh yeah.
Yep.
Let's do that. Okay.
You
Here we
did
are.
it. Thank you.
Thanks for your help, Narissa. Okay. So what are we talking about here? Mostly pipelines, but mostly we're talking about large interstate natural gas pipelines to also include infrastructure associated with those projects, like compressor stations. And this is certainly not to exclude some of the purely intrastate pipelines that have been proposed for Virginia and that we are working to stop, and working also to stop new investments in large fossil fuel burning power stations. But these issues are all interrelated. So I first, in the slides here, I've got some pictures of construction of the Mountain Valley Pipeline. And for those of you who aren't familiar with this issue already, this is a pipeline that was proposed way back in 2014. It is currently under construction, and it is a 303-mile project that would ship natural gas from fracking fields in the northern part of West Virginia over the Blue Ridge Mountains into Virginia, and its terminus would be in Pittsylvania County, Virginia. But the company has also proposed an extension of that pipeline that's called Mountain Valley Southgate, or MVP Southgate, to start with slightly smaller pipes and go from Pittsylvania County, Virginia, down into North Carolina. And so here you've got some of the pictures of one of the biggest problems of pipeline construction on the steep slopes in the western parts of Virginia, and throughout the agricultural land through which the pipeline would traverse. They've got a lot of problems managing sediment pollution in the waters of the Commonwealth. And so here we're talking both about surface waters, wetlands, headwater streams, as well as groundwater, because they have to do blasting and trenching through rural communities to be able to bury the pipeline. So people's well water is sometimes also under threat from this project. And what happens when a bunch of sediment gets into the water? I'm not a scientist, but what my layperson's explanation is that a lot of these little critters called benthic macroinvertebrates are choked out. They can't breathe. There's no oxygen in the water. They die out. It becomes an unhealthy aquatic environment for which a lot of our aquatic life to survive. But it's also a real human impact, as we see some of the slides of construction and muddy runoff and the introduction of large loads of sediment into people's drinking water supplies. So here, more pictures here of failed attempts at keeping the dirt on the mountain in place where it should be, and what that does to the water. So after this sort of grim introduction, let's just get right into the problem statement here. We're of course talking about the impacts that new fossil fuel infrastructure has on our water and the air we breathe today, as well as the climate impact going forward. So, you know, the introduction of new greenhouse gas emissions at a time when we need to be reducing those as quickly as possible. So just quickly walking through these bullet points, the Mountain Valley Pipeline itself, estimates are that the greenhouse gas emissions associated with this facility would be similar to those that would be produced. A low-end conservative estimate is it's like the equivalent of 23 new coal-fired power plants. The company has also made proposals to increase the pressure on this line when it is put into service. so that they could ship more gas each day. And under the sort of high emissions scenario, it would be closer to the equivalent of 32 new coal-fired power plants in terms of its greenhouse gas emissions. Another major problem with this is, I mentioned that Southgate extension. We saw this with the Atlantic Coast Pipeline, which we're all very happy has been canceled. But the community in which, so that you've got the main line coming into Pittsylvania County in Chatham, Virginia, and then they want to build a large compressor station to ship the gas further south via the Southgate pipe into North Carolina. This is in the Bannister district. It's a voting district in Chatham. That neighborhood is majority Black. This is an environmental justice issue. Once again, a proposal to put a polluting facility in sort of a cluster where there's already other polluting facilities, and it happens to be a majority minority community. So that's a big problem. Mountain Valley Pipeline cannot keep the dirt out of the water, as the slides clearly showed. And another problem we have in Virginia here is that I mentioned the pipe gets smaller in Chatham and going on to North Carolina. Virginia only does a Clean Water Act and Virginia Water Protection Permit review of these interstate pipeline projects when the pipe is greater than 36 inches in diameter. So that main MVP line is regulated because it's a 42-inch diameter pipe. But under Virginia's current law, that Southgate extension would be unregulated because the pipe shrinks from 42 inches and the extension is only a 24-inch diameter pipe. This is something that we think needs to be regulated in Virginia. So a few solutions that we propose, I think most of these, but not all of these, are in the briefing book paper. So starting at the top here, there's already a site suitability analysis in our air pollution law, and we would propose adding something similar to the state water control law. So shoehorning some of that similar language that would really say, when the board reviews these projects, they need to take a hard look at whether really this project is suitable for the area in which it is proposed. I mentioned the size of the pipes. So the second bullet point here really refers to bringing pipes as small as 24 inches diameter into our regulatory regime. And then third, and the last two bullet points are newer ideas. So they may not be described in the paper, but we have an anti-degradation law in our Virginia water laws, which basically says the quality of the water cannot be made worse than it currently is without a permit. And we would like to see some social, economic, and environmental justice language added to that part of our state water control law to ensure some pretty stringent regulation. And then finally, we are told specifically Delegate Hurst, should he keep his seat, is interested in a budget amendment that would provide funding for additional water quality monitoring. We know that the Virginia DEQ has had trouble having enough staff to monitor construction of the Mountain Valley Pipeline and all the pollution events, and creating a mitigation fund for communities that are trying to repair things like their lost well water resources. So these are the policies that we are looking at moving forward this session, if at all possible. And if you have any questions, there's my email address, and I'll hand the mic back to Narissa. If I unshare my screen.
Thanks, Peter. Next, we have Jamie Brunkow to talk to us about potentially hazardous chemical spills. Jamie?
Yeah, good afternoon. Thanks, Narissa. I have a couple of slides to help walk through my issue as well. Bear with me one sec. Okay, everybody with me so far? The thumbs up.
Yep, we can see your slides.
Excellent. So I'm Jamie Bronco. I'm the Senior Advocacy Manager and James River Keeper with James River Association. And I'm going to talk a little bit about above ground chemical storage tanks. And to help illustrate the importance of this topic, I wanted to take a step back and first talk about toxic floodwaters. Some of you listening to the webinar may have saw the report from a few years ago released by the Center for Progressive Reform, as well as with Noah Sachs from the University of Richmond and with the James River Association. So we collaborated to build a model looking at risk in different parts of the James River watershed. The James covers about 25% of the state of Virginia and goes through right through the heart of the state. So it was a good test example to look at some of the issues that are likely happening around the whole state. And of course, we're covering Hampton Roads, Richmond, and then some of the less populated, but still areas affected where communities are affected by potential spills out in the western part of the state. So, in a nutshell, we developed this model. We looked at the geography. We looked at the CDC's social vulnerability index. We looked at the different regulatory programs out there, Superfund, Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act, all the federal and state programs that basically tell us what's being permitted and what's being stored currently around the state. Finally, we looked at sea level rise models. We looked at hurricane storm surge models, and we looked at flood zones from FEMA. Put all those things together, and it helped us to start to understand where we can really see risk, not only risk of there being flooding from hurricane, storm surge, or just heavy precipitation, but who is going to be affected most in these areas that are impacted by those conditions. And that's because there's likely to be spills from industrial sites, places where there are chemicals stored, places where there are harmful things, maybe right next door to communities living near the water. And so you can start to see some spots showing up, not just in one place, but really across the state. Probably no surprise if we zoom into Hampton Roads. We have large military bases, industrial areas, and a lot of flood exposed facilities, if we incorporate all those factors that I started off with. And so some of the conclusions of this report were that we had a lot of risk across the whole state. You can see how that varies with different category storms, but also with hurricanes rather, but also with the FEMA flood zones, how many sites we have exposed from a 100-year flood and a 500-year flood. We've had some really high precipitation events in the last few years since we released this toxic floodwaters report. 2018 in particular was a record precipitation year, and we've seen some concerning levels of precipitation. So I think that the risks going forward are only increasing, unfortunately. Okay, so one of the conclusions from that report was that we should focus more energy in Virginia on above ground chemical storage tanks. These are really what they sound like. They're tanks that are above ground, they're not buried, and they're going to contain some chemical. The ones we're most concerned about are those containing hazardous chemicals or extremely hazardous chemicals as described by the Environmental Protection Agency. And there's a good reason to focus there. We've had high profile spills around the country over the years. The one that comes to mind that's really close by is one that happened in West Virginia. We had a leak that occurred, that's what we're seeing here in the photo, and discharged a lot of chemical into the Elk River upstream of West Virginia's capital city. This also happened to occur while legislators were in session for the West Virginia General Assembly. And we had people rushing to purchase bottled water, could not use their tap water for a period of time. And this chemical spill really put this issue in the spotlight. That year, West Virginia passed legislation to start to regulate these above ground chemical storage tanks. Currently, they're not really covered by the Clean Water Act. They're treated differently, and companies are not required to report what they have in these tanks. They're not required to report maintenance there's not, especially concerning, there's not the spill prevention focus that we would like to see to prevent these really concerning incidents from happening. So we found also in Virginia, due to our own studies, that there's a lack of siting requirements, and there's a lack of regulatory requirements for these kinds of facilities. So following the West Virginia spill, the General Assembly did act and required this study to occur, looking at chemical storage in Virginia. And this was something that was really called out. We don't know exactly how many tanks we have in Virginia. We don't know where they are located. We don't know what hazardous chemicals are being stored, and there are not records on how those tanks are maintained. So how do we address this gap? Well, a first key step, and this is pointed out in that 2016 report to the General Assembly, is that we need to inventory and register these facilities. And that's really key to start to move forward. And they also pointed out some emergency response plans and issues related to that. So our proposal, and what you will find in the briefing book, is that we want to establish a comprehensive regulatory program. And that's sort of the gold standard. We want to start to capture where these tanks are located, what's in them, spill prevention plans, maintenance plans. We want to prevent the sort of incident that can cause people to get sick, or in worst case scenarios, loss of life. We're not talking about chemicals that have no consequence. These are things that can really hurt people and hurt communities that may live right next door. There is a model out there. So we've been regulating oil tanks for many years. And so there's sort of a pathway to do this, to register tanks, to keep maintenance records. We've already done this for oil tanks. And so we can easily use that as a model to establish registration, reporting, inspections, and set these standards for above ground chemical storage tanks the very same way that we've done for oil tanks. So we have been working with some senators and delegates at the General Assembly for a few years to continue to work on a solution to this issue. There has been legislation introduced in the last couple of years. We worked with Senator Surville, Delegate Lopez, and others, and this has also been discussed at some of the State Water Commission meetings in the last year. So we are, as a group, Noah Sachs from the University of Richmond, also the Center for Progressive Reform, and Potomac Riverkeeper have all been working together with the James River Association to continue to put pressure on moving this issue forward. It is something that we expect to move forward this year at the General Assembly, and we would like to have a registration and reporting regime set up in Virginia to start to capture this universe of tanks. But then again, we want to ultimately have a comprehensive set of regulations that really prevent spills. So I hope that gives you enough information to kind of understand where we're heading and our goals. I really hope for those listening, you'll reach out and consider joining in with us. We definitely need more organizations, more folks advocating for this. This is not an easy issue by any means. It's complex, and it's going to take some work on our part to really get through and get reform. But it's a really important one, I think. This is one that directly affects people, directly affects our rivers and streams, and we know how to address it largely. There's a model out there. We just need to kind of build the political will to rise to the challenge and meet it. And that's all I have. I'll turn it back over to you, Narissa.
Thanks, Jamie. Next up, we have Anna Killius, also with the James River Association, to talk to us about unregulated industrial toxins. Anna?
Thanks, Narissa. And I think Kyle has my slides, so if he could put those up, that would be great. I'm going to take a few seconds to introduce you to a world of industrial toxins called emerging contaminants. These are chemicals that are not currently regulated, but for which there are growing concerns about their impacts on human health and our environment. These chemicals aren't necessarily new. For example, one family of emerging contaminants called per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, or PFAS, have been used widely in many types of industrial products for decades, despite the growing evidence of their harmful effects on human and ecological health. Can folks hear me?
Yes, you're coming through fine.
Okay, so I'll just keep going. And so PFAS are a family of thousands of long-lasting man-made chemicals that are distinguished by their carbon and fluorine bonds. That particular type of bond means that these chemicals are resistant to water, fire, and grease. Originally, that property made PFAS highly sought after for firefighting foams that are used for petroleum fires on naval vessels and airports. But soon, PFAS were being used in everything you can think of, from water-resistant clothing to stain-resistant carpeting, even the coatings on your popcorn bags and pizza boxes that keep the grease off your countertops. That is all PFAS. Consequently, PFAS are widespread. They are persistent, and they can bioaccumulate within our environment and within our bodies. Exposure to PFAS has been linked to toxic effects for both humans and animals, and those include things like decreased fertility and increased high blood pressure during pregnancy, developmental delays in children, increased risk of certain types of cancer, and even more important today, reduced vaccine response. So your body's immune system is not responding to those vaccines the way it should. So next slide, please, Kyle. So remember that the definition of emerging contaminants like PFAS are a concern, not just because they are toxic, but because they remain unregulated. So for example, of the many ways that PFAS enter our bodies, one of the most concerning is through our drinking water. But there are no national drinking water standards that limit the amount of PFAS that we can be exposed to by our drinking water utilities. EPA recently pledged to move forward with national standards for 2 types of PFAS, but other states are doing more to be proactive in protecting their residents from PFAS contamination. And Virginia has been slower to step forward, but we've made some small progress. So in 2020, the General Assembly passed legislation that requires the Virginia Department of Health to conduct a sampling study of no more than 50 water sources to see if they could find PFAS. The GA also passed a bill that goes into effect next year that requires the Board of Health to set drinking water safety standards for PFAS and 2 other types of industrial toxins. There are thousands of drinking water works across Virginia, but since we were limited to only 50, we prioritized where we would do the sampling based on a couple of factors. We chose the 17 biggest waterworks so that we could understand the quality of water reaching the largest number of Virginia residents. And then we chose surface water and groundwater systems based on their proximity to where we think there could be possible risk of contamination. So we ended up with 45 waterworks that agreed to participate in that study, and 63 sampled locations because some of those waterworks have more than one intake or well. A single sample was taken at each of those this past spring and summer. So the next slide will show us the results. So that draft looks a lot bigger than I thought it was going to be. None of the sample results were higher than the EPA's health advisory level of 70 parts per trillion for 2 types of PFAS, PFOA and PFOS. And none of the samples were higher than any of the more proactive regulations we've seen set by other states. But 15 of the 63 samples did find reportable levels of PFAS from 10 different waterworks across the Commonwealth. And you can kind of see, but a lot of these are clustered in the Northern Virginia area. We had a couple of locations in the Hampton Roads region that also found multiple types of PFAS. And then we had one location in the Roanoke region that had our largest single sample of one type of PFAS, and that is Gen X. You may recognize the Gen X name from the news and from contamination issues that happened at the Chemours facility in North Carolina. Again, things to remember, extremely limited snapshot, 63 locations across the state of thousands of waterworks. So we can't draw conclusions about the type of risk and where the risk is coming from, but we know it's out there We found the PFAS, and we have to keep pressure on our agencies to keep looking for contamination and setting safety standards. So next slide. Just a quick second to stress that while PFAS poses a risk to all Americans, like all other types of pollution, communities of color and low-income communities bear the brunt of the contamination. And this report from the Union of Concerned Scientists kind of backed up that idea that low-income households and persons of color are disproportionately living next to contaminated sites. So final slide. So these are our policy recommendations. They're all included in the briefing book paper, but basically we need industrial users to disclose their chemicals. We need to start eliminating the pathways from contamination. So getting the PFAS out of the environment to begin with. And then we need drinking water standards. We need to keep VDH, the Department of Health, moving forward on establishing those standards. And all of this takes funding for all of the agencies involved. If you have any questions, my contact information is available, and happy to hear from y'all. Oh, and back to Narissa, of course.
No worries. We actually had a bit of a technology snafu, so I was actually sharing your slides, so I had to stop sharing. But no worries, we'll keep it moving. Thank you so much, Anna. Next, we have Stephanie Rinaldi with Friends of Buckingham to talk to us about industrial metal mining. Stephanie?
Yes, thank you. Let me try to share my slides. Hopefully this works. Is it working?
Yep, we can see your slides.
Thank you. Okay. Well, thank you all again for being here. Special thank you to Jess Sims for authoring this page with me. This here on the slide that you're looking at is a mine in South Carolina, so don't get too concerned, that's not Virginia yet. But as some of you may know, we learned that in your mine company was conducting exploration. Yes.
Your audio is choppy. You might want to try turning your video off.
Okay, 1 second. Sorry about that. I am in rural Virginia. Okay, how does that sound, Narissa?
Wonderful. Thanks, Stephanie.
So again, there's a Canadian junior mining company that's been exploring in Buckingham County. They last year boasted findings that they said made them hopeful for a mine similar to this one in South Carolina. These kinds of mines, these open pit mines, expand to encompass hundreds of acres. They utilize cyanide and other harmful agents to extract gold from the ore. Those harmful agents often leach into the ground and surface water. And these companies also build earthen dams to hold back the mine waste, but those dams often fail. Now, that was last year. As is common with all extractive industries, that was just a foot in the door. This year, they have expanded to explore for copper, lead, and zinc in Buckingham and 2 other rural counties, Campbell and Pennsylvania. These metals are mined in the same manner as gold. And mining like this has not been conducted in Virginia. It's modern day industrial metal mining. So our regulations don't properly address this type of mining. The areas that are being explored are rural. They're places with large communities of color, low income communities, and places that are and have been targeted by other industries. Those areas are at highest risk for contaminated drinking water, ruined agricultural lands, the forever problem of acid mine drainage, but they are not the only communities at risk. This map, which has never been seen before, y'all are the first to get a look at this. Hopefully it's coming through clear for you. This is a map of the Virginia Department of Energy's approximated gold pyrite belt. and its proximity to downstream surface intakes for drinking water. So this belt is not only an indicator of where mines might be viable, but it is an indicator of how much of the state could be affected by these mines. It might be kind of hard to see here, there's a lot of information, but over 3 million Virginians could have their drinking water at risk if this kind of mining is allowed to go forward with the regulations we currently have. So what are we doing about it? Last year, we introduced a bill and the General Assembly took it up and passed it to require a study on the effects of industrial gold mining on health and welfare in Virginia, and to look at the current state of regulations regarding gold mining. That study is supposed to start in the next couple of months. It will be finished by December of next year, but it will only focus on gold. And the General Assembly declined to institute a moratorium on gold mining while they wait for the results of that study. So this year, because exploration has expanded its locations and targets, we're going to ask the General Assembly to use the findings of that gold study to also assess the impacts of and regulations on these other metals minings, types of metals mining, excuse me. We're also asking them to press pause on the issuance of new permits for the mining of these metals and gold until that assessment is complete. So that is the issue in a nutshell. If you guys have any questions, obviously there will be Q&A and you can always email me. My email is here on this slide. And if anybody, any organizations are interested in getting involved, please do reach out. We could use all the help we can get here. So thank you, and back to Narissa.
Thank you, Stephanie. Last but not least, we have Walton Shepard with the Natural Resources Defense Council to talk to us about decarbonizing the industrial sector. Walton?
Thanks, Narissa. Hey, everyone. Walton Shepard talking to you from here in Richmond, Virginia. And I'm looking at the clock and I want to leave time for questions and discussion because that's usually the most fruitful part of these endeavors. So I will keep it relatively brief, and thankfully it's a relatively streamlined topic. As folks know, we are trying to address climate change, doing what we can here in Virginia. As you know, hopefully at COP next week, nations as well will do their part. But as far as here in Virginia, folks are probably aware that transportation is about half of our climate pollution. Energy sector is about 30%, but declining a little bit. 10% is buildings, that is buildings fueled by either directly fueled by natural gas for heating, fuel oil, or propane, typically for heating hot water, cooking, and space heating. The other 10% that is kind of the hardest sort of sliver of reductions to get to is industrial facilities. That's about 10% of our total climate emissions in Virginia. And right now, we're not using anything in the toolbox to get at those emissions. And we want to get at all emissions in some way, somehow, to kind of claw our way to sufficient reductions to address climate change in time. And one of the actual fair reasons we haven't gotten to industrial emissions, which, by the way, do include local pollutants as well, not just carbon pollution as far as the climate goes, but just, you know, local air, NOx and SOx, and more pollutants of the kind that Anna brought up. The reason they're hard to get to is facilities are not one size fits all. You know, you can have a cement manufacturer and a glass bottling company next to a metal fabrication plant. You know, manufacturing and sort of industrial processes are kind of run the gamut. So it's hard to just say, hey, all of you need to clean up your act. Because it's hard to say that because there's no uniform solution for that. But one way of kind of taking a small but important first step and first bite out of industrial emissions is in concrete manufacturing for typically used for roads, but also buildings. Concrete is always locally made. You can't transport concrete over long distances. So every state has a fair amount of concrete production with, you know, just locally, because you can't truck it very far. In Virginia, what we're trying to do this session is a voluntary program that essentially incentivizes Virginia's concrete producers to essentially green their production process to lower the climate pollution associated with making that concrete, which, by the way, is energy intensive, right? We're crushing rocks, we're heating things, and if they voluntarily green their supply chain and production process, they get certified by a third-party certifier. They exist in the world, and they essentially, when they go to the state, which is the largest concrete purchaser in Virginia, is the state, you think for road construction primarily. When they go to the state procurement process and put in their bid, if they have a greener supply chain or less carbon intensive than the standard concrete production process, they essentially get a sort of a bonus in their bid. It shows up as a stronger bid than it actually is from a cost perspective. Say they're bidding at $5 per cubic foot of concrete. It shows up as, say, just as an example, $4.75. They're still charging $5, but it shows up to the state as a cheaper bid to kind of give them a premium for greening their supply. So it's totally optional. It encourages the producers to be innovative and figure out where to, green and clean up their supply chain with innovation. It's that sort of first step to making industrials realize, hey, it's good for business to make ourselves cleaner, right? We want all our large business concerns to be moving in that direction. So this is this legislation would do that. Down the road, we want to get deeper cuts from industrial processes, whether it's concrete or metal fabrication or what have you. But this is a kind of entry-level way that even, say, a centrist Senate or, God forbid, a Republican-led House of Delegates can get on board with because it's voluntary and because it rewards innovation while also cleaning emissions locally in Virginia, because that's where these facilities are located. So it's called Clean Concrete. We're hopeful to have our patron nailed down soon, and look forward to the discussion. Thanks, Narissa.
Thanks, Walton. And as Walton alluded to, we are now in the Q&A section of the webinar. As I mentioned at the top, you can submit your questions using the Q&A function. And I will just go ahead and hop into the first question, which I think is likely meant for Connor. This question is from Tori, and they ask, how many of these conversion companies are on the books or in planning?
Yeah, great question. Right now in Virginia, there is one company that has, I think, mostly completed the permitting application process. It's called Braven, B-R-A-V-E-N, and they've applied for a permit in Cumberland County. They are a plastics to fuel company. So they plan to cook up the plastic and turn it into a fuel. There are other companies in Virginia that just talk a lot, but have not actually applied to the state for an operating.
Thank you. We have actually one more that I think was sent into the chat, but sort of related. This is from Anne. Anne says, per my county supervisor, a Winchester, Virginia company recycles plastic bags and makes them into boards that often become backyard decks. How much of a good thing is this?
Interesting. I'm not familiar with the company. What I do know is that there is often recycling programs where the companies will come and make a deal with the locality. So for instance, they will say, we will collect all of the plastic waste from your route of residential users and then take that to our facility and cook it and make something else. All of those endeavors have failed, including Salt Lake City, Utah, which was the largest such effort, which collapsed. But if it's not not connected to a locality and it's just a business making something out of it, it would depend on their process. So for instance, if they are actually building out a large scale conversion process in order to get to that end product, then that's where we would be concerned about the emissions products, just as if it was like creating a fuel or turning plastic back into plastic. So while it can seem like a good thing, the devil's in the details of the emissions from such a facility and how well they're being tracked and managed.
Awesome. Thanks, Connor. I am currently not seeing any additional questions. I might give it a brief pause here in case someone is trying to send one in. Not a question, but Tori submitted and said, terrific presentations, everyone, and I would agree.
Thank you.
All right, not seeing any more questions. I think I'm going to go ahead and close this out and give people a few more minutes back in their afternoon. Thank you all for attending. Thank you to all of our authors and presenters. If you have any additional questions in the future or as you're looking through the common agenda, please feel free to reach out to the authors. Their contact information you can find in the briefing book, which also is online in case you don't have a hard copy. You can also reach out to me at any time as well, and I can help get you contacted to the right folks. Our next and final of these webinars on equitable and inclusive government will be next week, next Thursday, November 4th at this exact same time, 12 to 1. So I hope you all can join us. Thank you and have a wonderful day.
Thanks, Marissa. See ya.
Thanks. Have a good day.